Thank the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. We now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Chairman, I just promoted you this afternoon.
Being called worse.
And it did not take 15 rounds of voting to do it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our ranking member for her steadfast leadership in pursuing truth and protecting our democracy. The federal government has a long history of weaponizing its power against minorities like communities of color, religious minorities, and immigrant communities. Women, Latinos, people of color, and religious minorities are the actual victims of a weaponized government, not billionaires or politicians with frail egos. House Democrats spent 4 years fighting to enhance civil rights and liberties and stop the weaponization of government against our most vulnerable communities. Now my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have assembled this misnamed and misguided committee to grandstand and to try to lecture us all on the weaponization of government. But the American people know that this committee and MAGA Republicans are all about all show and no substance, or as we say in Texas, all hat and no cattle. This committee is designed to inject extremist politics into the justice system and to shield the MAGA movement from the legal consequences of their actions. These political stunts undermine every agent, officer, prosecutor, law enforcement, and the entire justice system. We should instead dedicate some time to oversee direct interference in prosecutions and investigations. We should instead dedicate our efforts to investigating the abuse of power, the president's pardon power by the former twice impeached president. We should instead dedicate time and efforts to investigate the weaponization of the federal government to undermine and overturn the 2020 presidential election. I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we will have follow-up hearings to do some of that. Now I ask for unanimous consent to enter a letter from Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, outlining these and other recommendations for this committee into the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the assault on the Capitol, which we've already discussed, many of us, including myself, were removed from the floor and evacuated. A lot of things happened, and I, for one, consider it more than just a riot. Some have suggested that this committee may try to erase the truth about the horrible days of that event. The idea of denying the truth about January 6th is horribly offensive to me, and I'm sure that it's even more offensive to the law enforcement officers who were on duty that day. Mr. Williams, I know you're familiar with that day, and you're familiar with the halls of Congress. You worked on the Hill, correct?
I did, Congresswoman, thanks.
Were you there on the Hill on January 6th?
I was not present on the Hill on January 6th.
Do you know others who were?
I certainly do.
Can you understand why it would be offensive to the people who were there, many like me who were on the floor and got pulled out, had to try to put on a gas mask and told to hit the floor? And of course, the many law enforcement officers who had to rise to the duty. Can you figure any way that we can defend this if anyone tries to rewrite what happened that day?
It's the second part of your sentence that I want to pick up on, Congressman, because it's not just former colleagues and friends of mine that were here. It is law enforcement officers that I know, and there simply is no place for threats against law enforcement in a civil society. So, I will echo everything you said. It was real. 1,000 people have been charged with crimes. Several have been convicted of very serious crimes. It was a real event.
So what is your reaction to the politicization of January the 6th?
I think, as a general matter, Congress works at its best when working in a bipartisan manner, and I think that becomes even more acute when talking about violent crime or threats or terrorism, as the word was used here, or even acts of insurrection.
Right, so you do agree that it is domestic terrorism?
And my former federal prosecutor friend at the end, we'd share this. There's no domestic federal terrorism statute. I want to be careful in how I talk about that. Now, certainly, there are acts that comprise what would constitute terrorism, violent crimes, and so on, that might fit under that definition. And another thing for Congress to consider, if it wishes to, is to pass a domestic terrorism statute.
All right, are any of the investigations contemplated by this subcommittee comparable to the scale to the investigation of the attack of the Capitol?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the question, Congressman.
Are any of the investigations contemplated by this subcommittee comparable in scale to the investigation into the attack of the Capitol?
You know, I'm not certain as to what the committee's full mandate is, but to be clear, what happened on the day of the Capitol was a historic event that ought never happen again, and perhaps it's in Congress's interest to work toward that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.